Thank you.
So, very briefly, no, I come also from development economics, no, for different reasons. In the last almost 25 years, we have been specializing on the topic of China. I always say I'm not a sinologist. Note the irony. You have good sinologists that start 1000 before Christ, and if they do not get to 1000 after Christ, that's okay for them. No, we start in 2025, and if I don't get to 1000 after Christ, I don't have a problem with it either. No, so we try to analyze the political economy, the socioeconomy of China from a Latin American and Caribbean perspective, and this is relevant. This is, you can examine, analyze China from Berlin, from Mexico, from Beijing, and you will come up with different results. No, I would simply highlight in the time I have two topics, some recent research that has been going on in Latin America together with colleagues from all over the world, including China. And secondly, some concepts that are fundamental, in my humble opinion, that is important to understand, to examine China and the Latin American and Caribbean China relationship in order not to fall into the descriptive trap. No? If you look at the web pages of this Red Académica de América Latina y el Caribe sobre China, 700 members, no? But we have gigas of information on trade, on investments, on infrastructure projects, and I could put everybody to sleep. No? In May, the exports increased by 5%, and in June it fell by -3%, and in July, we do this kind of work. But if you do not have concepts and the method of analysis, you end up putting to sleep everybody. No, this is pretty common in the so-called social sciences. I will send you the PowerPoint. You will see some references. I invite you very strongly to look at the web pages of the CECHIMEX, Centro Estudios China Mexico, and of the network. Both are absolutely free. No, in some cases, this is a result of thousands of hours of work of students, colleagues, etc. And with a couple of clicks, you can download the information. No, I am very proud, and thank you very much, Rogelio, for the reference with this recent book by Lin and Reiner Publishers. This is unfortunately not for free. I hope that through some of your institutions, you are able to buy it. Probably in the next months or years, there will be some PDF files, not today. And there are some other documents recently that we have been publishing. No? So topics that are, in my opinion, relevant to understand the socioeconomic relationship between Latin America and the Caribbean with China. One topic is the topic of employment. No? So China is not a topic for sinologists, for specialists, but for everybody that is interested in the topic of employment. This is a social, local, global, national topic, fundamental for everybody that is interested in the issue of employment, wages, the quantity, quality of employment, etc. We started with this topic almost 10 years ago with the ILO in Peru. And just to give you an idea, and these are topics where I would humbly highlight, these are topics to be followed by people interested in Latin America and China. No? So China has generated, according to input-output matrices, more than 8 million jobs in this long period, 95-2021. No? These 8.1 million jobs are the result of net trade through input-output matrices, but employment generated by OFDI. OFDI is the outward foreign direct investment of China and Latin America, and infrastructure projects. No? These 8.1 million jobs account for almost 15% of employment generated in Latin America and the Caribbean. 15%, which means almost 1 in 6 jobs generated for this long period are associated with China. This is not minor. No? And by the way, the only way to compare it with other countries, for example, the United States, in this period, the employment generated by net trade from China is larger than the employment generated by the United States. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm simply saying we have to pay attention to a topic that nobody is examining in detail, neither in Latin America, by the way, nor in China, not to speak of the European Union. One important topic. You will find a group of publications, working papers, books, etc. Second topic, the issue of value added in trade and exports. Very hotly debated. No? I am very critical of the so-called think tanks in Washington, but by the way, also in China and in Europe, and in Germany very concretely, in Hamburg and in Berlin, you have a couple of think tanks, and I always say, at least on this topic, Latin America, China, neither think nor tanks, but we call them think tanks. Well, what can I do? No? To have an idea, so this is a hotly debated topic, surprisingly, with very little data and information. The so-called think tanks are not doing their homework. Just to have an idea, we could do a presentation again and do a seminar on this. How do we get to this data? What does this mean, etc. But just to have an idea. No? So Mexico, we could do the same for Brazil, Argentina, and 8 other countries. Input-output matrices from the OECD and the World Trade Organization are not for all 42 countries yet. So imagine, Mexico exports to the US. No? In the late 1990s, more than 25% of Mexico's exports were US American value added. Chinese were close to zero. And this has increased importantly until 2020. This is the last data we have from these input-output tables, to 7.5%. No? So 7.5% of Mexico's exports to the US is Chinese value added. No? This would give Mr. Trump would be happy to hear about this. No, I told you so. Mexico is becoming the back door of Chinese imports. But who is importing in Mexico? 70% of Mexican imports are being done by transnational and foreign corporations established in Mexico, and mainly from the United States. No? So one of the topics I will share with you in a moment is new triangular relationships. Yes, Mexico is importing and exporting Chinese value added, but the main factor that allows for these imports are General Motors, Siemens, Volkswagen, but also Ford and many others. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm simply saying welcome to a new industrial organization, highly complex, that has evolved in the last years. I will go more quickly. A recent publication regarding the impact of China in the everyday life of Latin America. Surprisingly, a topic very little examined and analyzed in academics. No, I say jokingly, let's imagine a day without China in Latin America. No, we would walk barefoot, without underwear, telecommunications would not work, subways would not work, airports and ports would not work. Very difficult. So a book, 400 pages, looking at a group of impacts and effects on everyday life of China in Latin America. Finally, we have a monitor on China's investments in Latin America, but in this book, published last year, Latin America, surprise, is also investing in China. No? So 15 translatinas from Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, among others, investing for 20 plus years in China. Very interesting. No? Again, not good nor not bad, but simply to understand the new complexity in the 21st century between Latin America and China. If you're interested in some of these topics, again, I very strongly invite you to this seminar that we will hold at the end of May, 110 plus presentations, 6 keynote speakers for free, 100% by Zoom, no? 3 very intensive days of presentations from people all over the world. I finish with a group of concepts that I believe are important to understand China today, based again on a group of experiences and research in the last 20, 25 years. I invite you to consider the concept of a globalization process with Chinese characteristics. Again, I am not saying good or bad. I'm simply saying consider that China, since 2013, and President Xi Jinping is proposing a new globalization process, no? With Joseph Stiglitz, Roderick, and many other discussions on who is benefiting the 1%, the 10%. China is humbly today proposing a globalization process. I would highlight with a group of concepts, not only an economic process, it includes Confucius institutes, cultural institutions, etc., in which infrastructure projects are the basis of its own domestic development in the last 40 years, known as the process of reform and opening up, no? In which, through infrastructure projects in China, China has been able to develop R&D, technology, and it has a group of transnational corporations that are able to build infrastructure projects all over the world. We have a monitor of Chinese infrastructure projects in Latin America. We will publish our next annual report in probably 1 week or 2 weeks. Very impressive what is going on regarding Chinese infrastructure projects, no? With a long-term cooperation proposal, very different to what is going on since January 20th, 2025, no? So one concept. The second concept is the concept of the public sector in China. This is for me a very fascinating institution, no? The public sector and the omnipresence of the public sector. The public sector in China is the sum of the central government, but it includes provinces, municipalities, and cities, and very surprisingly, with 2 important factors. One, a very aggressive competition within the public sector, no? So very different than in most of Latin America, by the way, also in Europe and in the US, no? So ask Volkswagen, when they entered China 30 years ago, they said, we're going to sell cars to hundreds of millions of inhabitants in China. Surprise, a dramatic and aggressive competition process. This leads to the very simplistic accusation, China is neoliberal. No? And so with that, we kind of understand China. I humbly would say that is politely not sufficient. So you have a factor of dramatic competition within the public sector and a long-term cooperation within the public sector. All these activities are done under the umbrella of the Communist Party of China. No? We have done work on specific global value-added chains from auto parts, automobiles, telecommunications, electronics, among others. To have an idea, today, in the 2020s, this public sector today has the property of around 45% of China's GDP. There is no other country in Germany, in the US, in Japan, or in Mexico, in which the public sector, defined as this one, not as state-owned enterprises. That would be a joke of the public sector. There is no other country worldwide in which the public sector accounts for 5% of the property of GDP. In the case of China, this is 45%. No? So the question, does China do an industrial policy, does not understand the political economy of China today. No? Of course they do educational policy, industrial policy, trade policy, R&D, because it's their own property. Does the city of Beijing do industrial policy? Of course. No? The main car producer in China, the name is BAIC. Few people understand what BAIC stands for. BAIC is Beijing Automotive Industrial Corporation. It produces more cars than Mexico as a country. No? So does Beijing do an industrial policy? They will tell you, I don't know. We don't know it by that name, but we do everything that you can imagine under R&D, technology, industrial policy, financing, educational policy, etc. If you do not understand this concept, you don't understand China's policies today. Finally, two more issues and then I finish. The concept of new triangular relationships. No? Today, some colleagues have been attempting to discuss China and the relationship with the United States as the Cold War, new Cold War. No? My daughter, who is 26, Cold War, she never grew up under the Cold War. She Googles it and it has something to do with the Soviet Union and the US, no? Soviet Union, it does not exist anymore, no? So it is somehow related to Russia. And so China is like Russia with the UN. That's not very intelligent and not very useful. What we are witnessing today is a full-blown systemic competition between the US and China, which have different political systems and different economic systems. In the case of China, based on its public sector. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm simply saying we have to understand what is going on. No? And so, if we have a full-blown confrontation between the US and China for 10 plus years, based on this systemic competition, one of the main challenges from a Latin American perspective is what will third regions and countries do? Africa, Latin America, Asia, but it could be Germany, Mexico, or Belize. What are we going to do regarding hundreds of topics? The confrontation is not only regarding innovations and R&D and electric vehicles, which are very fashionable, but this is about tourism, flights between the US and China, closing 100 plus Confucius Institutes in the US. You don't have one Confucius Institute in the US. No? So new triangular relationships. You will find a group of publications for more than 10 years regarding the analysis of new triangular relationships. Finally, an invitation to distinguish topics in the Latin America and Caribbean China discussion. No? So in Latin America, in China, the topic is very fashionable, no? And I would highlight that in many of these analyses, also in think tanks, researchers, whatever, we end up with green juices, no? Jugos verdes. You don't exactly know what you drink, but it is very healthy, no? So you put nopales and orange juice and whatever you find, and you have a green juice, no? This is what is going on in many newcomers that are analyzing the topic of Latin America and China, which means they put a little bit of trade. They start with the now 500 years ago, and they end up with the 5 and 6G, and they end up saying we have to improve the cooperation between Latin America and China. No? That I knew 50 years ago. Today, you will find detailed analysis on trade, specific global value chains, territorial impacts in specific countries, on financing that doesn't have anything to do with trade, on investments in Argentina, in regions within Argentina, debates on the methodology of analyzing investments and accounting for the statistics that are very different. You cannot simply use the statistics, neither from the European community nor from MOFCOM or from the Secretaría de Economía in Mexico. You have to understand the methodology to understand why, in some cases, statistics differ by 800 or 900%. No? So you cannot simply copy and paste what MOFCOM or Secretaría de Economía is telling you. No? And finally, infrastructure projects that are very different than investments, financing, and trade. You will find books, analysis, discussions, for example, at this 7th international seminar. Finally, the concept of security shoring. No? In the case of Latin America, you will find in the last 2 years the very fashionable concept of nearshoring. I always say jokingly, you have lots of shorings, no? Onshoring, offshoring, friendshoring, ally-shoring. I come from industrial organization. And you say, excuse me, what do you mean by these shorings? No? So usually the response is, yes, it's the relocation of processes and of segments of value-added chain. In the case of Mexico and of Central America, this has been going on since the 1960s. So we are speaking of 60 years. So this is not something really new. I humbly, and I don't have sufficient time and I'm talking too long, but I would humbly invite you, since we are in this inflationary discussion of shorings, I would humbly invite you to consider the concept of security shoring. What does this security shoring mean? If you read Janet Yellen, Biden, Jake Sullivan, the White House, since 2022, 2023, and very strongly with the Trump administration, the proposal is, in our relationship of the United States vis-a-vis China, our national security will be the main topic vis-a-vis or against China. No? What does this mean? Well, it means that free trade, innovation, culture, exchanges in the academic sector, all of them will fall under the heading of national security. Look at the executive orders since January 20th. They all start. I am worried with the national security. Because of this, the executive order discusses tariffs, fentanyl, migration, and whatever. No? So our economic security is national security, no? As Trump highlighted in the White House. No? And so I would say this is a much more intelligent concept in time and space, and not going back to the 1960s. No? Based on these concepts, I would highlight you can start discussing detailed analysis on institutions that are working in Latin America and in China and in Europe, if you want to, think tanks, no? On the Latin America-China relationship. You will find hundreds of topics regarding trade, investments, financing, infrastructure, cultural exchange, etc. Look at the web pages of Sechimex and Red ALC China with lots of conclusions, dialogues, policies, etc. A very vivid discussion. I would humbly propose you not to reinvent the wheel. No, in some cases you will find lots of analysis in Argentina by business organizations, by the public sector, by academics, no, and engage in these discussions. You don't have to start from zero. Oh, you know what? I came up with the idea of Chinese investments in Costa Rica. So let's begin from zero. No, you will find 10, 15, 20 papers, statistics, discussions, seminars, etc. And what is going on in many of these think tanks in DC, in Europe, also in China and Latin America, is they are reinventing the wheel. No? So integrate to the already existing debates and discussions. And I leave it there. I talked much too long, but I hope it was more or less clear. No? Thank you very much, Rogelio.
Thank you very much, Enrique. Well, so we'll just shift into this conversation, and I will just give also the floor to Gabriela so that she can also start with the questions, and then we continue.
Thank you so much, Professor Dussel. We're going to start this round of questions in English and slowly also move to Spanish to make it really inclusive of this very diverse audience we have tonight. First of all, I would like to thank you for taking us to deep thinking away from this very contextual analysis, descriptive analysis that now dominates the debate. And I would actually like you to tell us a bit more about what you understand as globalization with Chinese characteristics. We know that China as a trade, finance, infrastructure, technology partner has changed the global economy, has had huge impacts in Latin America. Could you help us understanding what do we learn by looking at globalization with Chinese characteristics away from this bilateral approach that you mentioned that will compare Costa Rica and China, Ecuador and China? What is the use of this concept, and how is the Chinese globalization different, or globalization with Chinese characteristics, to be specific, different from the US-led model that was dominant in the decades before this? So let's start from there and see where we go.
Mm-hmm. Again, I would invite you to look at some of the references that I put in at the beginning of the presentation, but I would highlight two or three issues. No, so we have been living since the end of the Second World War, since 1944, with a group of Bretton Woods institutions, no, based on the increasing liberalization of trade, of goods and services, of capital, no? And there has been a very vivid discussion regarding the impacts of this liberalization process and its limitations. I refer to Stiglitz and Danny Roderick. I've been working myself also for Latin America, etc. No? The proposal of China, a work in progress, it's not a finished process. Again, I'm not saying good or bad. I'm simply saying we have two different globalization proposals. The globalization process by China since 2013 with the One Belt, One Road initiative, which was later changed to the Belt and Road Initiative, again, I would highlight is based on China's domestic experience in the last 40 years, no? In Latin America, at least, and I believe it is not very far away in other continents, we are not taking sufficiently serious some of the outcomes and results of this development strategy in China since the end of the 1970s, no? So China has eradicated absolute poverty, 700 million persons. This has been analyzed by the World Bank, not the Communist Party of China or of China or both, no? And so in Latin America, we have not discussed sufficiently in development economics. What did China do? I mean, it doesn't matter if you come from the far right, from the far left, from the liberal, from whatever party you want to. What are these guys doing that we are not doing? According to CEPAL, Latin America has not been able to diminish absolute poverty. What is China doing? No? Again, taking out of absolute poverty 700 million persons, and by the way, allowing for an impressive upgrading process in terms of technology, etc., which is at the heart of the competition between the US and China, and by the way, also with Europe. No? Volkswagen is today learning that China has upgraded and has a better technology in a group of global value chains, and this is incomparable to the competition 10, 20 years ago, even 5 years ago. No? So China proposes under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative, I would tell you, dozens of initiatives regionally for Africa, for Latin America, for Asia. In the case of Latin America, for example, there is the CELAC China Forum. No? CELAC is this Cumbre de Estados de América Latina y el Caribe. The next meeting will be in 3 weeks on May 13th. No? Very important for the Latin America-China relationship, very difficult under this confrontation between the US and China. And so this CELAC China Forum, so this globalization process with Chinese characteristics is, I invite you will find this in some of the publications. They have, of course, long, very formal speeches and commitments, etc. But I invite you to look at the working programs, no? 3 working programs since 2015, where China, at the end, if you want to, proposes a portfolio of activities, hundreds of options, a portfolio in which even countries that do not have diplomatic ties with China, Guatemala, Paraguay, could engage in this CELAC China working program. So at the end, note the irony, a country could say, you know what, I am not sure what to do with China. So China is proposing from ping pong tournaments to nuclear plants. And in between, special economic zones, cooperation in exchange, infrastructure projects, transfer of technologies, etc. What do you want to do? El Salvador, Mexico, Brazil, or Argentina? No, you know what? I'm not sure. Let's keep it on a ping pong tournament. Note the irony. Or, you know what? We want to engage. President Correa in El Salvador, in Ecuador, 10, 15 years ago, we are going to build dozens of infrastructure projects that changed completely the energy grid of Ecuador. Again, discussions, you will see lots of empirical analysis, pros and cons, no? But this is serious. No, this is not just a commitment and let's improve cooperation for 2,500. No, this is today. Do you want to engage in infrastructure projects? We can do it. We have done it. This would be the Chinese stance if you want to. You don't want to do it, okay, that's okay. We are doing it with Vietnam, Ecuador, and Guatemala. If you don't want to do it in Mexico, that's fine, no? Infrastructure projects, again, are the most sophisticated and complicated relationship between Latin America and China and the Caribbean. Why? Because it is much easier to import an iPhone or a pencil from China. That's easy. If you want to do an infrastructure project, you have to know supplier systems, firms, legal issues locally, regionally, nationally, the environment, labor issues. Much more complicated than simply importing a car or a battery, no?
So, thank you, Enrique. So, well, to continue with an additional question in English. So, what you are just mentioning, it looks more like a tsunami, you know. Chinese progress over the years has been impressive. But I want to understand these dynamics on the other side, on the Latin American side. I mean, and to understand this, let's say, evolution from also the heterogeneity of Latin America regarding China's role in the global economy. So the question is, how do different countries in Latin America vary in their approach and openness towards China? Can we say there is a common stance, or it is more a passive, let's say, approach, or how has been the evolution of the region in the last years?
Look, in this recent book that I published, there is a chapter regarding institutions that work in Latin America and in China on the Latin America-China relationship. I would tell you, in general, it is surprising how weak the understanding and specialization is on China in Latin America by business organizations, by public institutions, even in academics. No, so you have this increasing presence, socioeconomic presence of China in Latin America, but in terms of business organizations, with one big exception, el Consejo Empresarial Brasil-China in Sao Paulo, which is a very powerful institution. With this exception, the rest of the institutions are surprisingly weak. In many cases in Latin America, you simply do not have business organizations specialized on China. No, so you have the Association of Soya Bean Exporters from Argentina. No, you would imagine a powerful institution with a building, 20-floor building, etc. No, they barely have the capacity of examining some statistics. No projects, no proposals, no financing, etc. Academics, very few institutions. It is very fashionable to set up institutes and centers for Asia and Latin America. No, I say Asia has 35 countries, Latin America 42, 35 by 42. You have more than 1,200 boxes. No, and then if you want to study history, political relations, economics, so 1,200 by 5, you have 6,000 boxes. No? And so how many researchers do you have? 2. You say, wow, either you have very intelligent researchers or you end up saying little. No, we have been working and researching on Latin America for 25 years, and the more we do, the less we understand. No? On China, if you want to work on Asia, Japan, Russia, for some, Israel is even part of Asia, you end up saying very little. No, so we have a strong institutional gap between this socioeconomic presence and existing institutions. And of course, the impact and the cooperation options between Latin America and China depends, I would tell you, on the respective administrations. Brazil, no? So you have under Lula, you have an effort to make the cooperation more profound, to be discussed if this is really the case. And of course, suddenly you have Bolsonaro in between, where cooperation falls. No, in Ecuador you have again Correa, who I mentioned, and then after Correa, this has practically disappeared. No, so it's not sufficient to say yes, with Ecuador the cooperation with China was very intense, and with Venezuela it was less so. We are working, and this is one of the topics that we want to improve in the short term, putting a list from Argentina to Venezuela, 42 countries, and to see the intensity of their relationship with China in terms of trade, infrastructure, investments, and financing. And you will end up with very surprising results, because for people that know of green juices, but little of Latin America and little of China, they will say, well, of course, the relationship between Venezuela and Cuba with China is the most profound. Surprise. You know what? This is not the case. This is simply a reflection of ignorance. The last credit that was granted by a Chinese institution to Venezuela was in 2015, 10 years ago. And since then, trade financing has been going down, non-existent, and in terms of infrastructure and investments, Venezuela, China, it has been zero. No? So, surprise, it is much more dynamic with Peru, with Mexico, with Chile, and Brazil. No? So again, it's a very dynamic relationship where you cannot give a general ideological recipe and say, yes, of course, Cuba and China are married for the future. This is not the case. No, this is ideologically appealing, but empirically wrong. No.
If I jump in, Rogelio, is that okay? Yeah, I wanted to thank you, because often, and I have many of my students here joining the session, we find ourselves with a caricature of China's presence in Latin America, often trying to understand that, is it a new dependency? Is it, triggering a process of deindustrialization of Latin America? So this is very interesting to actually look through this new lens that you propose, and a much more dynamic, organic understanding of China's changing role in the region. On that note, I would like to invite you to tell us a bit more about what you theorize as new triangular relationship. And I'm posing this question because many of us have been following the news also of the tariff, the trade war, U.S., China, and Latin America caught in between what seems to be this competition between global powers. But though the trade war takes a lot of our attention, I also want you to comment on the issue of maybe geoeconomics. For instance, we have also U.S. and China having some tensions over control of the Panama Canal and other important, corridors across South America. How this new triangular relationship that you propose help us making sense of these debates and maybe having different insights on what the traditional literature tells us about what's going on.
again, on these discussions of new dependencies, options of new dependencies, yes, this is an important discussion. Again, ECLAC or CEPAL, they will publish for this meeting, or this ministerial meeting that will be held in Beijing on May 13th. There will be a publication, 50, 60 pages, regarding the challenges between Latin America and the Caribbean on China. It's not a rosy picture, no? So you have a huge gap in terms of value added, in terms of trade, no? So 60, 70% of Chinese exports to Latin America are high value added goods, auto parts, automobiles, telecommunications, and Latin American exports to China account for 95% for low value added goods such as soya beans, meat, minerals, fish meal, etc. No? So challenges, plenty of them, no? And so you will find a group of proposals in terms of trade, investments, infrastructure, etc. Be aware of this discussion again in the next weeks, no? Between Latin America and China. New triangular relationships, again, it highlights simply that we have been witnessing this profound confrontation far beyond trade. No? It is very fashionable to discuss the trade war. No? I could tell you it's the Confucius Institute war. No? I was a visiting professor in 2020 at the University of Pittsburgh and witnessed how the university closed the Confucius Institute at this specific place. No? So they received a call from the State Department saying, we do not want these Chinese spies at your university. So either you want to continue with these Chinese spies, or we are going to put on hold $300 or $400 million dollars in projects that the U.S. state has at the University of Pittsburgh. No, so for the administration of the university, it took them 10 seconds to decide and close the Confucius Institutes. So it goes far beyond trade. No, we're speaking of a systemic competition in terms of political systems, of economic systems. You will find a group of analysis. I remember Loretta Napoleoni, a friend from Italy, with her ironic question, no? How is it possible that Chinese communists generate more competitive firms? I invite you again to read the issue of the public sector in China. It doesn't have anything to do with the Soviet Union. That would be a joke. No, these firms are today competing head to head with Siemens, Volkswagen, General Electric, Kia, and whatever. No, and so the big question is, if we have this systemic competition, and this competition and confrontation will overlive us, all of you, and myself, the younger ones, the older ones, this will go on for quite some decades. What will third countries do? New triangular relationships, from Germany to Mexico to Vietnam. No, hundreds of proposals of what to do in terms of lots of different topics, or each of them with implications. No, the Canal de Panama. It's an excellent example. No, so new triangular relationships. I've been a couple of times in the canal, and it is very difficult for a country such as Panama to decide in this confrontation, no, in which the two most important clients, and this varies from year to year, are the United States and China. No, no, I don't want to see the Chinese. No, I don't want to see the US American. I don't. Very difficult. The same with Mexico. I don't want to see Chinese value added in your exports to the United States, etc., etc. Hundreds of options regarding telecommunications, but also footwear. In this discussion regarding security shoring, any topic could be discussed under the heading of security shoring. I've been working for 10 plus years on the footwear industry, no? And I always say with irony, a firm in Mexico produces boots, and they are going to be used by the US Army, no? So you could imagine putting a nail in the boot, and so this becomes a national security topic, no? So it doesn't have to be only telecommunications and high-tech and cars. A sock could be a problem for national security, depending who uses them, how you use it, etc., etc. No, so the security shoring process is a serious matter. And again, since January 20th, look at these executive orders. No, all the topics begin with our national security. This is fundamental for our. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm not saying Viva China, death to, but I'm simply saying that if you do not understand the security shoring discussion, I witnessed it in Mexico. You have people that are still trying to return to 10 or 5 years ago, and when are we going to get back to free trade and NAFTA and TEMEC, etc.? I unfortunately believe this is over. We are in a new global period between, and fundamental is this confrontation between both economies, and what will third countries do? No? New triangular relations.
Thank you, Enrique. Also, well, perhaps just one more question, perhaps one more from Gabriela, and then we move on the questions from the audience. Just expanding on this concept of security sharing, which I've really found fascinating, but more on the direction or where are we heading to. And how do you see in your reading on the global affairs? So we have, of course, we are in a new era, as you are mentioning, a multipolar era where China is or will be a strategic global player. But they also have this China 2030 strategy. What is the meaning of this strategy for Latin America? Or they also have this 2050 plan. But how do they see if there is a different nuance in this short and long-term strategy? And how do you see also the response from the US regarding China? So it is like two different questions, but interesting just to try to understand the direction we are just moving on. Thank you.
Look, I don't have any kind of crystal to see what will happen tomorrow or in 5 minutes, not to say in 2050, no? But I believe that we are witnessing a substantial shift in the short and medium run in which China is already taking over regarding new technologies and R&D. No? There are some very interesting reports by ASPI, this Australian Strategic Policy Institute, no? In which they highlight that in the last 5 years, 57 out of 64 global value chains in technologies are already led by Chinese firms. Again, the public sector is fundamental. No? The most private firm in China is Huawei. No, and they are not let into the US because the founder is from the People's Liberation Army. That's the most private one. No, the others are simply property of the city of Shenzhen. No, are they going to pass information to the central government? They are part of the public sector. They will pass whatever is necessary in 30 seconds. By the way, as the US and European firms do. No, legally, illegally, etc. So, will they pass information? Is there any kind of privacy? The question is a joke. No, you do not understand China's political economy. So what we are witnessing, Robert Lighthizer has been publishing a bit. I think he's one of the few thinkers, if you want to, of this group around President Trump. He has been publishing very clearly, we are going to set up a small group of friends of the United States. No? So it's not going to be a new world order or the United Nations, but we're speaking of the United States with Britain and probably a couple of Latin American countries and Asian countries. This is going to be the group of US friends. And the rest are going to be a threat to the US and probably led by China or by BRICS or by other countries. So we are discussing a completely different world order in which institutions such as the United Nations will change dramatically, because I think in 2025, very soon, Trump will say, you know what, my friends, I will get out of the United Systems. This is completely useless for me, including World Bank and IMF and whatever, no? And China will have to decide if they want to finance these institutions, of which they have been very critical in the last 10 or 15 years. No? So China has been creating the Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, etc., parallel to the IMF and the World Bank. And what happens if suddenly the US says, you know what, this is useless for me, I will generate a group of friends much more functional to my interests, no? And again, new triangular relationships will be fundamental. What will Vietnam, Mexico, Germany, the European Union do? No? Will they finance the whole of the US in the UN system? I don't know, no? But this is being discussed today in the European Union, where the US is saying, you know what, my friends, take care of your own business in terms of military issues, trade issues, etc. I am not going to finance NATO and many other institutions. This will happen, I foresee, very soon. No? Again, the confrontation and new triangular relationship between the US and China is fundamental at all levels, not only trade. No? Trade would be a minor topic in this full-blown, full Monty confrontation. No?
And to probably make the bridge to the questions of our audience, I'm going to wrap up our commentary and discussion, maybe asking you, based on your work, on your research of the way in which Latin America has responded to this, what are the lessons for Europe? I mean, many of our audience members are based here in the European Union. I'm also thinking about, Draghi's report on competitiveness of Europe vis-a-vis China, innovation, research and development, industrial policy. I mean, these are ongoing conversations. What lessons can be drawn from the Latin American experience, and also your own understanding and reading of the most contemporary developments in that topic?
Look, I'm no European specialist. I studied in Berlin several decades ago. The Berlin I left does not exist anymore, no? Not the Germany and the European Union, not the Free University I got to know, etc., etc. I would highlight one. I have tried here in Mexico and Latin America with a group of European institutions, embassies, research institutes, etc., for 15 years, my friends, you have to take much more seriously the competition of China in third countries. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, in automobiles, auto parts, electronics, etc. Yes, tomorrow. Nothing, no? A big surprise, you know what, in markets such as Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, in the last year, 2024, almost 25% of new cars being sold in Mexico are made in China, no? Who are the main losers? The main losers are, well, US American firms and European firms, no? Surprise, no? They've been sleeping and have not been caring about third markets in Latin America. And well, we will have to see if there is a European way in this new triangular relationship. What I can tell you for sure is that the European Union has practically disappeared in this discussion in Latin America and the Caribbean. I do not know of any strong topics that the European Union would highlight in this discussion in this confrontation between the US and China in Latin America. The European Union is simply non-existent, no? This worries me. It's a pity, no? And of course, again, the competitive discussion, the systemic competition is also fundamental for the European Union, no? The understanding of the public sector in China is fundamental, and its ability to implement policies, no? With this institution of the public sector in China, imagine its ability to enact policies in 24 hours, no? If for whatever happens, we have diplomatic problems between China and Mexico, no? The public sector in China can, from Friday to Monday, take decisions very quickly, no? Oh, until you do this in the European Union, my God, this can take several 5-year plans, no? Again, I'm not saying viva the public sector in China and whatever. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that this public sector is very sophisticated, and this has not been taken sufficiently serious, neither in the US nor in the European Union, and by the way, not in Latin America, no? In the monitor we do, for example, of Chinese investment in Latin America, I invite you to look at it. It's a huge database, almost 700 transactions, transaction by transaction, etc. You know what? More than 70% of China's investments are being done by public firms, no? This is very interesting, but of course it's also a massive threat. If you happen to have some problems with China and the public sector in China, from Friday to Monday, this can change very quickly and rapidly, no? So again, you have to know who you are inviting to your house. And most of Latin America don't know about this. And then they are suddenly surprised that something happens, no? Because the information and the understanding of China today in most of Latin America, even in the public and private sectors, is very weak, no? So, and I finalize, I invite you to understand, I believe, welcome to a discussion, to understand how powerful this concept of new triangular relationships is. In most of Latin America, concretely in Mexico, there is an ongoing discussion. What shall we do with the confrontation between the US and China? With the concept of new triangular relationship, Mexico, but any other country in Latin America requires a strategy vis-a-vis the United States, of course. The United States for Mexico and most of Latin America is by far the most important points of reference in terms of culture, financing, trade, whatever, and China. It is not the US or China. You need a strategy vis-a-vis the US and China, no? And you cannot depend on the new executive order. Mexico, if you dare to go to the Select China Forum on May 13th, you know what? You will have a new executive order in which we will raise tariffs to 1,000%. You cannot depend on that. You need a strategy vis-a-vis the US and China, not or China, based on this concept of new triangular relationship. Some sectors in Latin America and in Mexico play with the idea, well, you know what, we are part of North America, and you know what, the reality is that the US is more important, so let's forget about China. Remember my first picture of, let's imagine a day without China. This discussion of the US or China is today not realistic. Maybe in 20 years, but today this is ideological discussion. This is not based on the socioeconomic reality of Latin America. Even for countries such as Guatemala and Paraguay without diplomatic ties with China. No?
Okay, thank you very much, Enrique. There are questions from our audience members. Please just raise your hand. Let me see. Preguntas. Bueno, yo voy a hacer una en español un poco para hacerla hacerlo más plural. Un poco también comentando, bueno, retomando esta idea que planteas respecto al, bueno, un poco velada, ¿no? El tema de la creciente autocratización, ¿no? Que hay un debate y una preocupación importante aquí en Europa, sobre todo, no solo respecto a la política de Putin respecto a Ucrania, pero también respecto a la creciente influencia de China en Europa. En Alemania hubo esta discusión importante sobre las inversiones chinas en el puerto de Hamburgo y en otros lugares. Pero bueno, digamos que a partir de este año la preocupación que se tiene en los círculos del desarrollo tiene que ver con la creciente autocratización del mundo y sobre todo el papel de estos nuevos líderes globales que presumen de muchas cosas, pero no tanto de ese carácter democrático como lo entenderíamos en Europa o en otras zonas del mundo, ¿no? No sé cómo ves esta discusión, cuál es tu crítica, en qué medida también está muy sí, exactamente la discusión. No sé, ¿cómo lo ves?
Mira, yo te diría en general, con mucho cariño, con mucho respeto, con mucha humildad, pero el viejo concepto del eurocentrismo, viviendo en América Latina, la relación de América Latina con China, este eurocentrismo es fantástico, ¿no? Yo lo he vivido con instituciones y estas fundaciones europeas y alemanas con las que hemos tratado por ahí de hacer algunos proyectos, y incluso yo te diría de muchas de estas fundaciones políticas. No, sobre China no podemos hacer nada porque es autocrático, una dictadura, además no les interesa el medio ambiente, no respetan ninguna regulación ni leyes laborales. Entonces, China es un desastre. No vamos a gastar un evento, un centavo sobre China, porque eso desde una perspectiva europea, pues no es comprensible, ¿no? Y yo creo que ahí Europa, a ver, yo diría, en forma en forma de buscar generar una discusión. Mira, peor de los casos, China está haciendo lo que Europa hizo durante 500 años, China lo está haciendo en 10 o 15 años, ¿no? Entonces, oye, y China está haciendo un desastre ambiental, lo hizo Europa durante 500 años, ¿no? Y China está haciendo un desastre laboral, lo hizo Europa durante 500 años. ¿No? Entonces, exigirle a China que no haga lo que hizo Europa durante 500 años me parece bastante ridículo. De nuevo, la discusión es más puntual, pero yo te diría que en buena parte de los think tanks, debates, discusiones. Mi madre es alemana y ve la Deutsche Welle en México y entonces me llama todas las noches. Oye, Enrique, ¿y es cierto que los chinos se comen a no sé qué y hacen y qué? Digo, no puedes creer todo lo que hace, lo que dice la Deutsche Welle y cualquier otro, ¿no? Parece que China es un monstruo. No es cierto simplemente, o sea, no, buena parte de estas discusiones sobre teoría del desarrollo, etcétera, se han quedado con que China canibaliza el comercio, el medio ambiente, las relaciones laborales, etcétera. Empíricamente es falso. ¿No? Cuando uno ve el monitor de la OFDI de las inversiones chinas al 2025, sorpresa, en energía, la gran mayoría en los últimos 10 años de las inversiones chinas en energía son no fósiles. ¿No? Verdes, si tú quieres. No tengo un banco de datos para hacer lo mismo, para hacer una comparación con la Unión Europea, pero no voy a hacer que las inversiones chinas sean más verdes, sustentables, no fósiles, que las europeas. ¿No? Entonces, seguimos repitiendo, es que China destruye todo. Eso simplemente empíricamente no es cierto. No estoy diciendo viva China, pero lo que sí estoy diciendo es integrémonos a lo que se conoce, ¿no? Y China está poniendo plantas solares, hidroeléctricas, también plantas nucleares y muchas otras cosas. Entonces, China es mucho más complejo que una visión simplista donde China no es democrática, con China no queremos nada. Eso a la academia europea y a las empresas europeas, etcétera, les va y les está costando mucho. Es una visión muy simplista, muy mecánica, muy lejana a la realidad, ¿no? Yo los invito a considerar, la relación de América Latina con China es sumamente compleja, profunda, extensa, madura, ¿no? Es una relación de dos niños de 15 años, ¿no? México tiene una relación diplomática con China desde hace 53 años en cultura, intercambio académico, turismo, por supuesto, comercio, inversión. Son décadas de una relación. Entonces decir, no, estos son autoritarios o autocráticos y entonces con esos no hablo, eso le va a costar mucho a Europa.
Y bueno, tenemos también aquí una pregunta de la audiencia que ata con otro tema que te quería preguntar, Enrique. Jacqueline pregunta si América Latina puede aprender alguna lección de la estrategia china para reducir la pobreza rural y generar un cambio estructural. Y ahí añado mi pregunta, también viniendo a la economía del desarrollo, precisamente, y como ecuatoriana, viendo de hecho, trabajaba en la administración de Correa cuando teníamos esas conversaciones de cambio de la matriz energética y de generar una transformación productiva, estructural. Nos encontramos con cuellos de botella y tú adelantas la película y se le culpa mucho a China por la reprimarización de la economía ecuatoriana y el extractivismo que ha generado despojos y temas de destrucción ecológica. Entonces, ¿qué lecciones podemos aprender de cómo lleva China su transformación estructural? ¿Y cómo nos aseguramos que la presencia en financiamiento, inversión, comercio, no nos lleva a frenar nuestra propia transformación estructural en América Latina, alejándonos de esa idea de política industrial modernizadora que una vez se barajó en la región?
Mm. Mira, tu pregunta es súper interesante, súper actual. eh, la estamos discutiendo acá con Morena. Morena es el partido político de la actual presidenta Claudia Sheinbaum, y el Instituto Nacional de Formación Política, etcétera. Digo, no se trata acá de copiar y pegar la experiencia china, eso es un chiste, ¿no? Pero de nuevo, incluso en gobiernos de izquierda, en Brasil, en Ecuador, en México, sin entrar a una discusión qué es izquierda o qué sé yo, el concepto del sector público en China me parece que no podemos cerrar los ojos y, como dicen por ahí, ni lo veo ni lo oigo, ¿no? Es un sector con una capacidad de generar competencia, tecnología, innovación, con una coordinación de largo plazo. Me parece que es importante porque, en fin, las izquierdas latinoamericanas pues han estado muy tímidas, ¿no? Y entonces tienes de pronto un gobierno de disque izquierda, pero discutir el tema de la propiedad de las empresas, pues parece que es un anticristo. Dices, no, como eso, eh, añorador del pasado, de la sustitución de importaciones de hace 50 años. Pues te dirá el colega, recibimos a cada rato delegaciones chinas, te dirá, pues por eso es que están como están, pues tienes la Volkswagen en Puebla hace 60 años y eres incapaz de diseñar un tornillo, ¿no? Olvídate de un auto, ¿no? Este, eh, en fin, no estoy diciendo que hay que copiar y pegar, pero sí estoy diciendo que no podemos cerrar los ojos. Entonces, en términos del tema de la erradicación de la pobreza absoluta, ¿no? Eh, no tengo la menor duda de que tiene que ver con este sector público y con los proyectos de infraestructura. Si el que ha ido a China, yo he ido demasiadas veces, según mi familia, a China en los últimos 25 años. El que ha ido a China, pues uno va en enero y vas en junio de nuevo, pues hay 3 líneas nuevas de metro, 15 nuevos hospitales, 25 nuevas escuelas, 35 no sé qué, infraestructura que tiene que ver con este proyecto de globalización con características chinas, de empresas chinas. No es la General Electric, no es la Siemens, no es, sino que son empresas chinas. Y esas son las empresas, todas públicas, que están construyendo proyectos de infraestructura en Ecuador, en México, en Brasil y en Argentina. Entonces, desde la perspectiva de la teoría del desarrollo, me parece una institución muy poderosa, ¿no? Que usualmente en Estados Unidos, incluso en China, se discute después bajo las State-Owned Enterprises. Pues las State-Owned Enterprises son 117 empresas. Eso es un chiste del sector público, ¿no? O sea, si uno amplía el sector público, gobierno central es relevante, no estoy diciendo que sea irrelevante, pero si uno lo amplía a ciudades, a municipios y a provincias, uno se encuentra con un sector público omnipresente, que está en cualquier cadena global de valor altamente competitiva bajo la coordinación del Partido Comunista de China. Ojo, donde, volviendo a la pregunta de Rogelio, a ver, es un partido político, ¿no? Eh, eh, si en la socialdemocracia alemana o en la CDU se toma una decisión, en el partido político puedes tener la libertad de decir, oye, no estoy de acuerdo, bueno, pues salte del partido. Pero en el Partido Comunista de China te aseguro que hay debates, discusiones entre sus 105 millones de miembros, mucho más de lo que mucha gente se imagina. Mucha gente piensa que es la Unión Soviética de hace 60 años. Eso es un chiste, ¿no? Entonces, es un partido político, sí, y si no estás de acuerdo, pues vete con el partido de enfrente, pues es que el partido decidió que se va a hacer 1, 2 y 3. Oye, yo quiero 4. A ver qué parte no entendiste. No, ¿no? Entonces, tienes la libertad de irte a otro lugar. Entonces, en fin, no se puede cerrar los ojos ante lo que se está discutiendo, planteando en China, con grandes retos en China, retos ecológicos, retos políticos, retos sociales, pero con avances sobre lo que en América Latina hemos venido soñando, ¿no? Que vamos a integrarnos como región, que vamos a reducir la pobreza absoluta, que vamos a producir un auto latinoamericano y pues no llegamos ni a una bicicleta, pero bueno, seguimos soñando, ¿no? Entonces, no podemos cerrar los ojos y decir ni los vemos ni los oímos, ¿no? No estoy cayendo en decir, vamos a copiar y pegar. No, no, acá no se trata de copiar y pegar. Pero, en fin, en temas concretos de reducción, erradicación de la pobreza absoluta en el sector agrícola, en sectores no urbanos, creo que hay mucho que aprender con todas sus contradicciones. Si ustedes se meten al eje temático de medio ambiente y agricultura de la red ALS China, van a encontrar docenas de capítulos, artículos muy críticos a China, sobre el caso del Ecuador, sobre casos en diversos países de América Latina, donde las cosas por parte de empresas chinas pues han salido mal y hay un proceso de aprendizaje, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, bienvenidos a una discusión, ¿no?
Enrique, estamos ya prácticamente terminando. Hay una última pregunta, no sé si te robamos 2 minutos más
La veo
de
de
tu
yo.
tiempo. De Job, dice, how do you see the rapid working age population decline that should start in China this year and the attendant increase in the non-working to working population ratio?
Look, Job, the Jagger, people such as academics, friends such as Barry Norton at the University of California in San Diego have been examining this topic for quite some time, worrying on this long-term trend. Yes, no? And again, welcome to an important discussion within China and outside of China. No, it is not a coincidence that the country that is implementing most of the robots worldwide is China. No, everybody would say, "What robotization in China? Come on, you have 1.4 billion inhabitants. What are you going to?" Well, from a perspective of innovation, of upgrading and trying to counter this decline in the population of the working age, etc., there are coincidence, trends, counter trends, etc. No, yes. China's population is declining, no? Although, again, these laws against, or regulations, not laws, against having more than one child have disappeared in the last years. But again, there are tendencies to try to counter this decline of the population, no? I don't know if this will be sufficient. I mean, everything in China is with lots of digits, no? So you have a shift from the population from the rural area to cities, etc., a trend that has been going on. Well, this would invite to another discussion, which is fundamental in the medium and long term. I fully agree with you, but I think again that there are counter trends in China trying to prevent the impact of this decline, ¿no?
Muy bien, yo creo que cerramos en español ahora mismo ya. Pues te agradezco muchísimo, Enrique. Agradezco
Gracias.
muchísimo a los participantes, a Gabriela por tu apoyo, por tu moderación. Yo
Gracias.
creo que hemos empezado con el pie derecho en este grupo y ha sido no solo una charla muy interesante, sino también el intercambio eh, ha sido muy provechoso y nuevamente pues esperemos que se amplíen las redes de comunicación, de interacción y que podamos también con este grupo pues hacer más cosas con los grupos, con Chimex, con la red ALS China y bueno, pues que sea, digamos que un puente con la región que es para nosotros, yo creo que lo más importante. Te agradecemos muchísimo, Enrique, por tu tiempo, por tu generosidad.
Gracias, Rogelio. Muchas gracias, Gabriela. Y en fin, a los interesados no puedo más que invitarlos a integrarse en estas discusiones, ¿no? Muchas gracias.
Gracias, un saludo a
Bien,
todos. Thank you very much.
hasta luego.
Bye. Bye. Hasta luego. Gracias. Gracias a todos.
Bye.